And we're going to have people join us any minute. Hi, everyone who's coming in right now. We are thrilled to have with us today a great person, an expert in equality, and we'll start in just a couple minutes. We're letting people come in from our waiting room. And I'll share a little nugget of my day. Today is my youngest son's birthday. He was the one who was born during the legislative session. He's now 4 years old, which is crazy. That was a fun legislative session. People actually came together and were kind to each other, which is a little different than what we're seeing now. But anyway, happy birthday to March16, who's now 4. First legislative baby born during a session by one of the legislators. All right, so I think we're about ready to get started. So we'll go ahead and go. All right. Welcome, everyone. I am Kimberly Dudick. I'm the CEO of the Public Policy Institute of the Rockies and co-founder of PIPR, the Public Policy Institute of the Rockies. I'm here today with my co-founder and CFO, Sophie Moon. And we're hosting these Tuesday talks to further the Public Policy Institute of the Rockies mission of bringing attention to under-addressed issues in Montana, letting you know some of the great people working on them, and also giving you an opportunity to learn how to become involved. This also lets you have your questions answered. And today that'll be really interesting, especially with what's going on during the legislature. These talks are recorded and attendees can post questions in the chat box or the Q&A box to get answered. We'll try to get to as many of those as possible. And actually today we are not only going to be releasing the podcast of this episode, but we are starting to have this broadcast on MCAT, the Missoula Community Access Television Channel 189. It'll be Tuesdays at 8 o'clock and Fridays at 6:30. This one will not be broadcast tonight. That will be from a previous episode, but go ahead and tune in there if you want to see all of us, our shining faces, answering these questions and talking. Would love to have you. So today we're thrilled to have with us Sean Rager. He's the Director of Equality and Economic Justice with the Montana Human Rights Network. He's been an advocate of LGBTQ rights for over a decade. During that time, Sean co-chaired the committee responsible for defeating the anti-trans bathroom initiative and working to defeat a similar proposition in Alaska. He has presented at hundreds of educational events across the state and has worked on both the state and municipal levels to extend non-discrimination protections to LGBTQ Montanans. Sean has created and facilitated transgender, non-binary, and two-spirit support groups across the state, and also helped found Transvisible Montana. He's been recognized for some of this work by the Imperial Sovereign Court of the state of Montana, the Forward Montana Rockstar Hall of Fame, the 2018 Montana 25 Under 25, and has been awarded fellowships with the Trans Justice Funding Project and the Western State Center. He is currently leading the Free and Fair Montana Coalition, which is a number of state-based organizations committed to advocating for LGBTQ rights in the state legislature. And in his free time, if you believe he has any right now, Sean enjoys camping with his partner, Cassandra, and their cat, Copernicus. So Sean, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we are excited to hear from you. So let's just dive right in. I know there's a lot of exciting stuff going on right now. We're looking forward to have you talk about. So tell us about the work that you're doing with the Human Rights Network and what you're doing right now, especially with being with the legislature being in session.
Definitely. So the Montana Human Rights Network does three big things. We do grassroots community organizing and responding to white supremacist and hate events. We work with our members to advocate for public policy, and we do research and exposition on the far right. And a lot of the work that I'm doing right now is at the legislature during the legislative session, promoting economic justice and especially working on LGBTQ issues. And we know right now there is a lot happening with the legislature on LGBTQ issues. We've been tracking a number of bills, some of them directly targeting the LGBTQ community and some of them indirectly targeting the LGBTQ community. And I help direct the coalition that stands in opposition to those bills. So that's a lot of what I'm doing right now. And then when the legislature is not in session, We help promote progressive policies in other ways on both the state and the municipal level. And then in addition to that, we provide a number of educational opportunities across the state.
Well, thank you for your work and all you're doing right now. So how did you become involved in the work that you're doing?
You know, I actually studied chemistry at Carroll College. And if you would have told me back then that this is what I would be doing, I would have laughed. Um, when I was a student at Carroll, I actually had a summer job. And during that time, I was promised that I would be hired back that next season. And that next season rolled around and I was waiting to hear back. I had been promised the same job and actually a raise, and I never got hired back. And then I found out that the reason that I wasn't rehired was because a fellow applicant told the employer that I was gay. And I ended up losing my job because of it, or not getting rehired because of it. And so about that same time was when the city of Helena was considering a non-discrimination ordinance that was inclusive of LGBTQ protections, meaning someone can't get fired, denied housing, or refused public services because of who they are or who they love. And so I really debated, and after a little bit of debate, I decided to get involved with those efforts and volunteer with the Montana Human Rights Network. Several years after that, I was working in private security in Billings, and that was about the time that House Bill 2 happened in North Carolina. And that bill was the first real attack that we saw on the trans, non-binary, and two-spirit community. I'm a trans community member myself. I was originally assigned female at birth, but I know myself to be a man. And so when that happened, across the country and across the state of Montana, there was a devastating effect. And there was actually a number of suicides that happened in the state of Montana. During that time, I had already been involved and started a number of support groups across the state. So I was face to face with a number of the people that were directly impacted. And one of our support group members from Bozeman actually committed suicide. And that's really when I started to realize just how much of an impact politics was having on my life. And so I had an opportunity to start working with the Human Rights Network on LGBTQ issues and as a community organizer in general. And as a result of that, I really started to get more involved.
Well, thank you for sharing your story with us. So now let's dig into this. You told us about the work you're doing. And I'm sure what really people, some of them want to hear about right now is what's going on at the legislature. We know that there are a lot of bad bills that are attacking equality. What can you tell us about what's happened, what bills have gone forward, what have died, and where we're at with some of the other stuff?
Yeah, so for a little bit of historical context, it is not unusual for us to be facing anti-LGBTQ bills. We have for a number of sessions in the past. But what is really unusual is the number of bills that we're facing. You know, traditionally we've had maybe one bill that we faced really attacking LGBTQ rights, and that's come in a number of different forms. Most recently in 2015 was a religious refusal bill, which is one of the bills that we're facing this year. And then in 2017, it was a bill just like we had in North Carolina that would require people to use the bathroom according to their birth certificate. So for example, that would put me in the women's bathroom. And we were able to defeat both of those bills. This year, coming into the legislative session, we knew that that we would be facing a number of bad bills. And so the bills that we're facing today and have come up in the legislative session are House Bill 112 and House Bill 113. Both of them are being sponsored. Both of them were sponsored by John Fuller out of the Flathead. And House Bill 112 would prevent trans athletes from being able to participate in sports. We've seen this in a number of other states across the country. And actually the first version of that bill was proposed and passed in Idaho and is in the process of being overturned through the courts. There's currently an injunction on it right now. We also saw House Bill 113, which would prevent trans youth from being able to access appropriate and medically necessary care. And House Bill 113 was actually voted down on the House floor and was overturned. Was voted down on the House floor. And then as a result of that being voted down, they actually brought forward another bill, which is against their own rules, but they decided to do that anyway, called House Bill 427. And that bill specifically eliminates some of the talking points that we were able to get very effectively on House Bill 413 and looks more specifically at surgery. In addition to those bills, we have Senate Bill 115, which is a RFRA. It's a religious refusal bill. And what that bill does is it says that anyone can refuse to serve, hire, or provide public accommodations for anyone on the basis of claiming it is a burden to their religious freedom. So someone could say, I'm not going to provide services to someone who comes into my hotel with a same-sex partner. Or an EMT, for example, could use this as a reason to refuse emergency medical services to someone once they discover that they're transgender. So it's very, very concerning, not just to the LGBTQ community, but to a number of other communities as well. Historically, RFRAs have been used and were introduced a number of years ago as a pushback after the Supreme Court ruled in favor of marriage equality. So that's a little bit of historical context there. I think one of the other things that's really concerning about the RFRA in particular is that we know that this is something that was originally used as a shield to protect religious freedom and has been turned into a sword to use the excuse of religious freedom as a way to attack diverse community members. In addition to those bills, we have Senate Bill 280, which is an attempt to require people to have surgery and go through a court process to update the gender marker on their birth certificate. So just a little bit of historical context on this bill. It was a rule that was written by the Department of Health and Human Services in the 70s to allow people to update their birth certificates. And it is a vastly out of date rule. There are a number of states that have updated rules since to update your driver's license, social security, passport, etc. do not have these requirements. And so the Department of Health and Human Services in 2017 came forward and said, we're going to update this specific rule to make it so that people aren't required to have surgery, because we know a lot of transgender people do not have surgery. And so as a result, it just so happened that that rule change coincided with the special session during 2017 that was supposed to be addressing the budget crisis. Unfortunately, they added it into the special session and brought it up as Senate Bill 10 to try and prevent the rules change from going into effect. Rules change, so they had several hearings and ended up turning down that bill, and the rules change went into effect. And now they're saying, wait a minute, that should have never happened. We want to overturn the rule that was updated and we had already voted on anyway. And so that is really an egregious attack on the community. As a whole, these bills are absolutely aimed at targeting LGBTQ community members, and especially trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks, and they're very egregious.
Let me ask you something. Why do you think that people have decided to target those groups and try and really take away their rights? I mean, what is your feel for that? Are the people evil people? Are they confused, or do they want to exert their power over those who they see as less powerful than them? And what is your feel for that, having been at the legislative session this year?
So I think that there's a number of things at play. First and foremost, this isn't just happening in Montana. It's not a grassroots effort. In fact, what we know is that this is a nationwide effort organized by groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which has been identified by the Southern Poverty Law Center as an anti-LGBTQ hate group. So it's not just in the state of Montana. We also know that just like after marriage equality, there was a massive push around anti-LGBTQ legislation. This is a response to the recent Supreme Court rulings of Oberfeld that gave increased non-discrimination protections and said that sexual orientation and gender identity are covered under, I believe it's Title VII of the Constitution. So this isn't a Montana movement, and it's not what Montanans want. I think that that is a big piece of it, that it's a pushback against some of the rights that we've gained. In addition to that, I think that there are kind of two different groups of people that we have that we're working with at the legislature or working against. We have people who don't know that they know LGBTQ community members and that don't have relationships with LGBTQ community members. And as a result, when they hear a lot of the rhetoric of the far right and of those targeted attacks, and people claiming that, for example, trans athletes are really men who are trying to participate in athletics to gain an advantage over women, they don't know that trans women are actually women. That there is no reason that someone would transition and go through all of that unless it was truly who they are. And so as a result, they hear some of the rhetoric from the far right and don't know that it's all false, that it's false rhetoric, and that it's just an attempt to attack LGBTQ community members. And then we also have the other side of that, which are folks who really dislike LGBTQ community members. And I think some of those folks were able to identify through their behaviors. For example, there was some reporting about when we were having the 215 hearing, and there were a couple of legislators that were snickering back and forth when a community member said that LGBTQ community members will leave the state of Montana, and gave a thumbs up and said, yay. So I think that we see kind of two sides of it. And really what we're trying to do is to bring forward Montanans, LGBTQ Montanans, trans Montanans, non-binary Montanans, and really say, this is who we are. And we're members of your community. And you may not realize that you know trans people, but we're active parts of the state. And we make up your community we make up parts of your community, and we deserve to be treated with respect just like everyone else. And everything that you're hearing from this other group is false rhetoric, and it's not who we are, and it's not what we're about.
Well, one last, I have a couple more questions, then we're getting some great questions from our audience right now. How do you think that this is different, that they can justify discrimination on somebody based on their sexual orientation or gender identity? How is that different than discriminating against somebody based on their skin color? This wouldn't be allowed if somebody was being discriminated against because they're African American, but for some reason, people seem to think it's okay to discriminate this way. Why do you think that is? Why is there that differentiation?
You know, I think that talking about some of the similarities and differences between racial justice issues and LGBTQ issues is complicated. You know, and it affects people very differently. So I don't want to say that it's the same thing, because there are vastly different histories and there's vastly different people that are affected by them. And there are a lot of people that are affected by both of them in very complicated ways. And I think that that also brings up a really good point about the difference between the laws that we have and the lived experiences of minorities, both in terms of racial disparities and in terms of LGBTQ folks. So, for example, we have laws against discrimination that protect people on the basis of ethnicity and national origin and skin color and all of these things. Those state laws don't necessarily include LGBTQ folks. However, what we know is that Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the state of Montana aren't free of discrimination. They have laws against discrimination, but that doesn't mean that the lived experiences reflect that. And I think part of the reason that there is such disparities is that they both influence each other. Right now, we're trying to lift up the voices of trans, non-binary, and two-spirit community members and LGBT community members to say, these are our experiences, and we do have experiences with discrimination. And passing laws like this will increase the discrimination that people face, because this is a law that affects the lived experience.
Thank you for that. So what do you want listeners to understand about the work you're doing and how important it is?
I think the thing that's really important that everyone know is that we need you right now to be involved and to lift up your voice, contact your legislators, write letters to the editor, and talk to your friends and family members to do the same. Because we need every legislator in that building to know that the state of Montana does not support these bills. The constituents that they represent do not support these bills. And actually what we know is that over 70% of Montanans support bills that increase protections for non-discrimination for LGBTQ folks. So it's really important that people reach out and make their voices heard for their legislators.
That's what I was just going to ask you, is how can people be involved? So
Definitely.
I think you just pretty much covered that. Reach out to your legislators, write letters to the editor, talk to people, and really get that message out there.
Absolutely. And if you have a personal story and are interested in sharing that personal story, you can reach out to me, and we will lift up your voice and make sure that people are aware of these are the people who are in Montana and these are the people who are impacted.
So how can people reach out to you? What is your contact information? We've been posting some of it in the chat box, but people may be just listening. So how can they reach you?
Yes, my contact information, the best way to get a hold of me is through my email, that's Shawn, SHAWN, at mhrn.org. Once again, that's SHAWN at mhrn.org.
Great. Well, thank you for telling us all of that and for all the work you're doing, fighting for all of us right now in the legislature. I'm now going to turn things over to Sophie to ask some questions that people want to hear the answers to.
Thanks, Kim. And thank you so much, Shawn, for being here today and all your exceptional work for all of us in Montana. The first question is asking if you would please speak specifically to the hearings tomorrow in the Senate Judiciary Committee, particularly on House Bill 112 and on Senate Bill 215. This participant is asking, what are good talking points that could help sway that committee in the right direction?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we're going to be talking about that's really important is not just the fact that this is discriminatory and will harm LGBTQ Montanans, but we're also really going to talk about how this will harm the state as a whole. We know that when North Carolina passed that anti-trans bathroom bill, that there were repercussions across the state. There were a lot of music artists that refused to book concerts there. There were some that even pulled out of concerts. The NCAA pulled out a lot of big tournaments. And in addition to all of that, there was a lot of harm done that's more difficult to measure. For example, the amount of tourists dropped substantially. And that has ripple effects to small business owners, to restaurants, to hotel managers, everywhere across the state that legislation was felt. And if we continue to move forward with these bad bills, they are going to have vast impacts across the state of Montana. Even just the fact that they're being proposed is having a negative impact on the state. In addition to that, we're really going to lift up the voices of the people who are most affected by these bills. We're going to share stories of people that were denied medical care, or that we're going to talk about just how important being able to play sports with one's peers is. You know, I think when we're speaking about 112 specifically, there's a lot of risk to the state financially. So, for example, given the recent Biden executive order, there's a chance that the state could lose over $350 million in federal funding. That's almost $500 million in federal funding, and that will have a massive impact to the state. In addition to that, we know that every time there is an NCAA football game in the city of Missoula, that brings in around $3 to $4 million in revenue. So the potential for losing tournament games or playoff games will have a massive impact on those communities. And then in addition to that, we're going to emphasize all the benefits of sports, especially on 112. We know that allowing people to participate in sports has vast, vast benefits to their physical health, to their involvement in the community, and to their mental and emotional well-being. Being able to participate with your peers on a team can greatly positively impact young people. And we want to make sure that people are able to participate.
Thank you for your response on that. I think that those kind of specific talking points are really helpful for folks who are, putting in comments or hoping to testify on these bills. Our next question is on the potential of national pushback. What potential for national pushback do you see on these unconstitutional laws that are heading through our legislature?
Yes. So as I mentioned before, some of these bills directly go against executive orders that have been recently issued. In addition to that, we know that big businesses have been signing on letters across the country in opposition to bills such as these. There has been pushback from the airline companies, from travel companies, even from companies like the Marriott, and because they understand that so much of their business is contingent on people wanting to travel to different places. So much of Montana's economy is contingent on tourism. And so to put up a giant flag that says LGBTQ people aren't welcome here, and this is a state that discriminates, doesn't just drive away potential LGBTQ tourism, but it also sends a massive flag to people across the country that Montana isn't open to tourism and we don't welcome diverse people here. And we don't want that to be the case.
Thank you for your answer on that. The next question is wondering, how does the Montana Human Rights Network get their data? What kind of sources do you guys have? For example, do you take surveys to poll Montanans, that kind of thing?
So Interestingly enough, one thing that has come up a little bit this session and in previous sessions is a local hate group that creates their own polls and sends them out and then reports those as accurate data. And, they phrase questions in a very biased way and different things like that. We're not interested in doing anything like that. So actually, we do not conduct any surveys or polls ourselves. When I mentioned earlier that over 70% of Montanans are in favor of non-discrimination protections, that is data that was pulled from an organization called the Movement Advancement Project, and they conducted that study. It is published online, and you can see that it has been published and it is online. Other sources that we get data from include the Rural Transgender Wellness Project, which is an organization that did a study looking at the determinants of overall well-being and mental health, including suicidality in the state of Montana and things that affect that. So that's another place that we get that data. That study that I was referring to from the Rural Transgender Wellness Project was peer-reviewed and was published in the Journal of Rural Mental Health. In addition to that, we look at other scientifically reviewed studies. For example, there were studies that have been conducted looking at discrimination against LGBTQ individuals. A really good study that we look at and reference frequently is a study that was conducted by the National Center for Transgender Equality, looking and surveying trans people for the amount of discrimination that they have encountered, and that's called the National Study of Trans Discrimination.
Thank you for going over all those sources with us. That's really interesting information. The next question that we have is just sort of, what are your takeaways from yesterday's Helena rally?
Yeah, so we had a rally yesterday in Helena for everyone to turn out in opposition to all of the anti-LGBTQ legislation. There was a great turnout. We had over 300 people attend. And I think one of the things that struck me was the impact of being able to gather in person. We required folks to wear masks and encourage social distancing, and we did have the rally outside to take precautions to help promote everyone's well-being. But one thing that really struck me is that one thing that's been very difficult and different this session is that people haven't been able, and it hasn't been safe for people to turn out in person and directly testify and share their experiences with legislators. And that, as a result, has created a little bit of a vacuum that has really emboldened some of the behaviors of legislators and different organizations that we tend to oppose. And as a result, I think that people have been feeling disconnected from community. They've been feeling disconnected from the democratic process. And I think yesterday was a great way to be able to connect with folks on a really personal level, to be able to see other LGBTQ folks from across the state, to see our supporters, to turn out in such numbers. And for me personally, it was very encouraging and very heartening to be able to see so many people turn out and say, this is who we are, and we're not going to let this behavior go unanswered in our state.
That's great to hear about that rally and how well that went. The last question that we have listed, if anyone else wants to answer some questions, throw them in the chat before too long here. But I wonder, obviously we have the legislative session, but there's more that Montanans can be doing to support our LGBTQ friends and neighbors throughout the year. What beyond the legislative session would you ask for folks to be doing to help support the LGBT community in Montana?
Yeah. So I think that right now, making sure that LGBTQ members feel supported is incredibly important because this legislative session is putting so much stress on the community, and particularly trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks. So right now, reaching out to the folks that you know that are trans, non-binary, and two-spirit, and just offering to buy them a coffee and provide space where they can talk or don't have to talk about what's happening is incredibly important. And then after the session is over, a lot of that work is going to continue to happen and will be really important. Having conversations about what you can do as a small business to make sure that you're recruiting LGBTQ folks, to make sure that your space is LGBTQ friendly. You know, thinking about things like making sure if you have a single occupancy bathroom, it's a unisex bathroom instead of having gendered bathrooms. Small things like that can be really, really helpful. And then in addition to that, we provide a lot of educational opportunities. We provide a lot of trainings on trans, non-binary, two-spirit folks and how to support them, what it means at a very basic level, how people can be supportive organizationally and through their businesses, and how to get more involved. So we're happy to provide those trainings. We provide them at a very low cost and on a sliding scale, and really encourage people to be able to utilize those. And then in addition, the last piece for trans, non-binary, and two-spirit community members, we have support groups that are happening across the state of Montana right now. We have online support groups. And then in addition to that, we actually just started a new parent support group. And so making sure that people are aware of that and are able to access community resources and know that they're not going through this alone.
Well, thank you so much for going through all these amazing ways that we can be supporting our LGBTQ friends and neighbors. And thank you so much for all the amazing work that you're doing. I'm going to hand it back over to Kim for the final 4 questions.
Great. Thank you, Sophie. Thanks everyone who asked questions. So I just posted in the chat saying if you want to send a message to provide your input to the legislature on these bills, I gave you a link, but it's ledge.mt.gov/web-messaging. So that's where you can go if you want to talk about, give your input on these bills. And before we get to the final questions, Sean, could you tell us again the bill numbers that people are still alive, and that people, if they're going to give a message, that these are the ones they should talk about? Yes.
So the big 4 that we're looking at right now is House Bill 112. That is the prohibition of trans athletes in sports. House Bill 427, which is the medical care ban. Senate Bill 215, which is the religious refusal bill. And Senate Bill 280, which is the birth certificate bill.
Excellent. Thank you for telling us those. It's important. So everyone, we have a great opportunity to really provide our input. I ask you to go ahead and do that if you can. All right, so let's get into the final 4 questions. It's just a kind of a chance for people to get to know you a little bit more. So what is a podcast you're listening to now and that you would recommend to others to listen to if you listen to podcasts?
So I will say my first and favorite podcast that I have and continue to listen to is This American Life.
Why is that your first, well, your first and favorite? Why is that?
I think that I first heard This American Life on NPR radio. And I really fell in love with it because of it's just entirely a storytelling podcast. And it tells a lot of different, very, very vastly different stories from across the country and from people of vastly different experiences. And oftentimes it tells some of the really interesting nitty-gritty pieces of subjects that you've never thought of before. And so that's something that I really appreciate, and one thing that I always pull up on my road trips.
Nice. Now, who's your favorite singer?
I can't say that I have a favorite singer, but I will say I have been listening to a lot of Janelle Monáe recently.
Okay. Janelle Monáe, huh?
Yep.
Awesome. And where's your favorite place to go in Montana?
I have spent a lot of time both as a kid and recently at Holter Lake. I grew up in Great Falls, and Holter is pretty close to Great Falls. And I think that it's just a beautiful place with lake, sky, and mountains.
Nice. And what is the best advice you were ever given?
This actually came from my sister when I had asked for help on writing a paper. And what she said was, just like with writing a paper, as in everything in life, you need to kiss. Keep it simple, stupid. So that is what I always keep in mind. Keep it simple.
Nice. It's very good advice. Well, thank you so much for the work you're doing, and thank you for talking with us today. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to share with us about how we can make an impact and how people can get involved. So thank you so much, Sean.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So to everyone who's listening today and who's watching, thank you for listening or watching. We're hosting these talks to provide an opportunity for people to hear about different people and organizations in our state and to learn about how you can become more involved in shaping your community. You can reach us at the Public Policy Institute of the Rockies, on Facebook at Public Policy Institute of the Rockies, on Twitter at Policy Rockies, on Instagram at PPI of the Rockies, or an email at info@pipper.org. If you have suggestions about other great people you'd like to hear from, please feel free to reach out to us and let us know what you'd like to hear. And if you want to listen to this episode again, or to any of our past Tuesday talks, you can find our podcast on Podbean, on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. And if you want, rate, review, and subscribe us to keep the conversations going. Thank you all, and best wishes, and let's keep moving Montana forward. Thanks again, Sean.
Thank you.
Take care.